Hey folks, welcome to Meta Abuse. I'm your host, Battle Mode, and we've got two co-hosts. It's Shaun, also known as Shifty. We've got Lucid Tactics as well for the first time on our podcast.
Yeah.
Say hello,
Hey, guys.
guys.
There we go, boys.
Guys, we've got a really interesting topic of conversation today. We're going to be talking about the concept that we've been seeing quite a lot of videos recently over the last sort of couple of years, really. There's been a whole spate of them recently, discussing the idea that RTS is a dead genre. And I think the three of us have got some stuff to say on this topic. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to ask, is RTS a dead genre? If so, how? And take a look at RTS as a genre itself and kind of some of the difficulties that it has as a genre that make it perhaps difficult to sustain an audience today.
Yeah, it feels like there's been, like Blizzard kind of abandoned StarCraft 2 recently. And it feels like a lot of studios aren't making RTSs. And of course, it used to be a super popular genre. And so I think that's the question. So let's do hot takes. What's your hot take on our RTS is dead, Ben?
I think my hot take is this is not a hot take really, but I don't think RTSs are dead. If you look at the player numbers of big games like Age of Empires 4, they're still getting 20,000 players. I think it's certainly the case that less, like with Civilization with 4X, that kind of skews the numbers for 4X. Okay, so you go, oh well, Civilization's got like 20,000 people playing, so 4X must be popular. It's kind of the same with RTS. If you actually look at the player numbers for more modest selling for RTS games, they don't get anywhere near 20,000 players. And you often find that some of the older games are doing a lot better. So I think my hot take is that RTS is going to end up being a dumbed down genre in order to try to appeal to more players, if developers even take the risk making them. And I think that other than that we're just going to see endless remakes of Age of Empires, StarCraft, the easy, safe options that developers, they don't have to work on this new IP. I think that, we're going to see endless remakes, at least for the time being, until the games industry grows tired of this remake culture that we're in. And I think if there's going to be any innovation, it's going to be from indie games and smaller, sort of AA studios, perhaps, that are being a little bit more adventurous. Because I'm not that convinced that the way that modern RTS games are being, the stuff that I'm seeing in some of the more popular modern RTS, it's not really what I want from the genre.
Shaun, what about you?
I don't think it's dead, but they're certainly nowhere near as popular as they used to be. And I think going forward, they're going to be mainly done by indie studios, which is what we're already seeing. And I think the style of that classic style of RTS, like your Command and Conquer, is going to be kind of rare to see. And we may see more in the way of hybrid sort of games. We've seen games like Northgard. There's upcoming ones like Falling Frontier. If anyone's heard of Conquest Frontier Wars, it's sort of like that, but not really, and kind of cranked to 11. So things like that where it's not pure RTS, if that makes sense. I think we'll see more of those going forward as they figure out how to progress the genre.
Yeah, I think for me, and this is lucid, but I had thought that they were dead. I was discussing with my work buddy. I was like, yeah, RTSs, it's totally a dead genre. And they're kind of dead to me. Because I feel like I enjoy watching StarCraft 2, like professionals. But like I watch it and I think, oh God, I don't want to do that. Like it just looks like a nightmare to play. Like 400 APM or something. And he started like, let's pull up some charts. Let's look at some of these games. And I got on this information deep dive of looking through top selling games and things like that. And I think while they might be a little dead to me, and while I think the games that are maybe more interesting to me are some of the hybrids, I don't think they're dead to players. I think players actually like RTS games like Age of Empires 2, Age of Empires 4 are crushing it. There's a lot of games, especially single player games. People get them, play them for 5 hours and then quit. And they got their entertainment value out of it. But people play RTS games for years. So I think it's a genre that people like. I think a lot of gaming is power fantasies. and the power fantasy of controlling a big army and having them do really cool things. Like somehow people are always going to want that. And I think when you look at innovations, like I think there was a lot of innovation in RTS for a while. If you think back to early RTS, you didn't have a build queue. You didn't have control groups. Like you had to literally box select all the units you wanted every single time you wanted to move them.
Box select wasn't even in the genre until later on. I mean, if you play Dune 2 now, there's no box select. You've got to individually select every damn unit, one by one.
So, there have been innovations that have made it easier to control, these armies and engage in this power fantasy of being a general. But I feel like a lot of the innovation, I don't know, it's interesting because I think some of the smaller games are clearly still innovating. And I think things like Supreme Commander tried to innovate on a pretty big scale. And I think they were reasonably successful. That can be one of the games we pull up. But I think that's an interesting thing because it's like, how much can you innovate in the direction of just having better control of armies where you still feel like you're in the same command and conquer RTS genre? And at what point are you like, not really? Is it a hybrid? But so my take is I think they're sort of dead for me unless there's kind of cool innovations. Things that go in the auto battler direction are really interesting and cool. It's obviously why I like Dominions a lot. But I think a ton of people like it. And I think it's in an era where studios are chasing this live service stuff where they're going to make $1 billion off a franchise. And it never happens. Things that have a good single player element. Because the problem with these live service games is a lot of them are winner take all. You're going to have 10 games that are going to win the whole market share. You can't, like people are trying to make another Fortnite. There's only going to be 1 or 2 Fortnites. Or maybe 4, but there's not going to be 10 Fortnites, whichever the best 4 everybody's going to play. And then the problem with those games is if it's all a multiplayer game and nobody plays, then even the people who liked your game can't play because they can't find a lobby. So I think there's actually a pretty huge audience of people who like RTSs. And I think in some ways it's a reasonably safe type of game to develop as long as you don't have too big of a budget. If you want to do a $300 million RTS, I think that's super risky. But I think if you do a $20 million RTS, you could probably make a lot of money.
Well, there's been a few attempts recently that have really let people down, I'd say. And some of them were very, very expensive and lost a whole lot of money. Speaking of which, this is one. I think actually just before we do this, let's just very briefly talk about what RTS is as a genre, at least as I understand it. So the first games in this genre, technically I think one called Herzog Zwei was probably the first recognizable RTS game. RTS stands for real-time strategy, but they're actually tactics games. They should really be called real-time tactics. Dune 2 was the Dune 2 Battle for Arrakis, I think is what it was called in the UK. I forget what it was called. I think it might have been called Battle for Dune in America, in the US.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the first game that was recognizable as what we see as RTS. And I think it's important to define what it was because it will help us understand the appeal of the games. So it's a base building game. You build a base, you collect resources in quite a simplistic way, and then you have to protect your resource lines. You pump out units, and then you send your units out to find and then destroy the enemy base. There's usually a meta game on top of it, a strategic game on the top of it, where you kind of make some choices about picking which mission you would like to do. And there's often some story element tying it together. And at least right from Dune 2, usually had some kind of cinematics. So the Westwood games, particularly like Dune 2, Command & Conquer, were absolutely legendary for having really, really well-made, if a little bit B-movie and schlock, but really, really well-made cinematics. And that kind of tied it together. So they were very, very strong single-player game experiences. And it was only later that they started to become multiplayer games. And this is possibly something we can talk about later because the conflict between single-player and multiplayer design paradigms is likely one of the key factors of why RTS developers seem to struggle making their games really stick with the audience.
I mean, there's a ton of classics. I grew up playing Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3, StarCraft, Dawn of War 1, all the Command & Conquer games. Command & Conquer, Iberian Wars, Red Alert, Command & Conquer Generals, Homeworld 1. that was my jam. If you asked me for a long time, my favorite game would have been Homeworld 1. But yeah, finally have the graphic here for Dune.
I'm nodding along with all of these choices. I played all of these. I played the original Dune 2 loads, and I played it on the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, actually. So I didn't have a PC at the time. But then the one that I really fell in love with was, I'd say, Command and Conquer Generals. That game is still good now. We were just looking before we started recording, and there were 1,300 people playing that game on Steam right now. So just goes to show you how popular that one was.
It's
I mean,
wild
these
to
games,
see.
by the way. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's wild to see just how some of these older games pop up. Like, so you were looking at Age of Empires 2 before. There's still 20-something thousand people playing that. And I think it's a remaster of an older game, but the fact that there's still that many people at all is pretty crazy. And yeah, I grew up playing the same sort of games. There's kind of an anecdote with the original Age of Empires. We ran a campaign. There was a campaign run by a cereal company called Kellogg's in Australia, and they had a cereal called Nutrigrain. And you used to get a disc for Age of Empires, a little plastic sleeve would come in boxes of Nutrigrain for a while. I ended up with about 4 of these discs for Age of Empires. And that was their marketing campaign. You'd get a game in a box of cereal. So I grew up playing that as well. And then June 2000. So that was like a reboot of June 2, I guess, something like that.
That was like 3D, right?
No, it was still 2D. I think it was like a 2.5D kind of thing. But then they went for Emperor Battle of June with proper 3D. I think that was when they tried to do 3D. And it was a bit janky, but I did play that as well. But a lot of the other ones, I think I sort of came in just after the original ones, just after June 2. And then I played a little of Warcraft 2, but was really into Warcraft 3, StarCraft, and Brood War. A little Homeworld 1. Never got huge. I think Homeworld 1, I hadn't heard of that until later on, so I didn't play a lot of it. But yeah, I remember playing through the campaign, and that was really cool as well. So yeah, I think seems like we all got started roughly around the same point, maybe been a little earlier. I think I was going to say about the real-time tactics thing. So there is actually a separate sort of subgenre called real-time tactics. And from what I can tell, I think the main difference between real-time tactics and real-time strategy is you can't build anything. You can't build more units. So that'd be like war game, regiments, there's Broken Arrow coming up, that kind of thing. So I think that's how they sort of differentiate between the two there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for this discussion, we might lump in some of the tactics, because I think certain games like Warhammer Total War 2, that's a game that, I don't know, to me, that's real-time strategy, even though you don't really produce anything. You produce things on the strategic map, but once you're in the battle, you don't make anything. But
just for context as well, I think, just so you know where my opinion's coming from, I kind of fell off playing RTS after Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars. Like, that was the first game where they really aimed it for the esports market. And I liked that game, actually. I played it multiplayer quite a bit for at least a couple of months, got quite good at it. And then I just kind of fell off the genre. I don't know why. So I didn't really go back to it until many years later, decade later at least. So my opinions, as always, are a little bit old and stuck in the past, I'm afraid. Although I have been playing RTS much more recently, in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And so, yeah, I have played some of the more recent games, and I've got an idea of where the genre is going, let's just say.
Yeah, and I think we can go through and look at evidence for this too. But I think one of the things that happened was, as games started transitioning from 2D to 3D, I think everybody in our era, like of our age, remembers there kind of being a rough transition from 2D to 3D, where 3D was this huge buzzword, and games were 3D on the packaging, but then the game didn't look as good as 2D games, and it didn't play as well. And it's kind of like, wait, is this better? And I think that was an especially hard transition for strategy games, because unit readability is really hard when you have low res texture models and you have 100 of them on screen. Those are really hard to read. I think it's one of the reasons why people love Age of Empires 2 is it's a beautiful sprite-based game, and the sprites are great in it, and it's super easy to read. And of course, they're even better in the remastered edition, which is recent. But this is so readable. You're never going to have something, or not never, but it's really hard to get something as beautiful and readable as this in the 3D engine. Because the textures are, I'll do a comparison. Let's look at StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2, by the way, is great 3D art. It's beautiful. This is about as good as you can expect. But just compare the readability of this.
Yeah, it turns out that 3D wasn't all it cracked up to be in terms of gameplay. Looks
Yeah.
nice though.
Let me see. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it sort of got there eventually, but there was that period of about 5 years where everything was super rough. I remember playing, what was it, Jedi Knight games, Jedi Academy, Jedi Outcast, and they worked, but looking back, I went, wow, those were horrendous. And you'd be playing and you'd have your multiplayer games and everything would be like real blocky and glitchy and weird. So with StarCraft 2, I remember this is about the first time that I got my first actual PC that was mine. I remember I got my first 1080p monitor instead of a CRT, and we loaded it up, and you could crank the shadows right up to max and the reflections and everything. And you'd have the Reavers walking around, like Reapers actually, the grenade launcher guys would be walking around, and you'd have the sun shining off their armor and stuff like that. And I was like, this is awesome. So I just remembered that from my first time playing it. It was so cool.
Look at this. And this is hard to read. I watch StarCraft 2 sometimes, and I've played it some, but I'm not a big StarCraft 2 player. So I don't know all the units, especially the campaign units. But you can't look at this as a non-StarCraft player and be like, oh yeah, this is this, doing this, this is this, doing this. I can tell there's a Marine right here, and these carriers are easy to see in the battle cruisers, but it's really hard to read. And this is amazing. StarCraft 2 is a sensation, right? And the artists behind it were amazing. But you compare that to this, and I know what these things are, catapult, knight, and they're really small. Look at the size of that, and I can tell that's a knight compared to, these things which are filling up my screen. I can barely tell that's a Marine.
This is another example, I think, where the need to appeal as an esport so that casual people or, audience people can watch and it look flashy and cinematic is taking over good sense in terms of game design. We see this in the fighting game community all the time. Like if you see a game like Tekken now, modern Tekken, which I do quite like, but there's so many cinematics, that you've got to, somebody will do a special move and you've got to wait like 4 or 5 seconds. It really takes you out of the game, but it looks cool for casual people watching, or people who just want to play for 20 hours and then play something else. That kind of game design, that kind of visual sort of appeal it does drag a lot of people in. And sure, you're going to sell more games when your game looks flashy, but in terms of functionality, and I don't care about graphics that much apart from how it serves the overall design of a game, right? And look at, Lucy's made a great point here about Age of Empires 2. Look, this looks great. It's easy. It looks great, but it's also the graphics serve the functionality of the gameplay. It's not that just made there so that it's flashy and looks cool when you're playing, when you're watching it as an esport or something. This is unfortunately a problem that is going right through games. It's not just an RTS issue. Unfortunately, I keep saying it, but the paradigm that you have to work to in order to sell games to a mass audience and make your money back as a developer, unfortunately run contrary sometimes to what actually makes a good, tight game. And I think, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here that Lucy's just brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much all games, in my opinion, went through a bad 3D phase. And then when you come out on the other end, like a lot of the current 3D games are gorgeous, but these problems I think are way exacerbated in a strategy game or an RTS game, especially an RTS game, because a strategy game is slow. You don't have movement. It's a lot easier to broadcast what something is because usually things are more symbolic. But in an RTS game, you have a ton of stuff on the screen. You have to make very, very fast decisions. And if you watch StarCraft 2 pros, they always turn it on lowest graphics, right? They don't have any of the flashy effects. They've got on the minimum because they care about readability. And so that's this huge conflict, I think, for RTS games is having pretty versus readable. And once you're in the paradigm of, okay, we're going to make a 3D game, like it's really hard to make good at 3D assets that are really readable. And that makes it hard to have a game you can play if you can't tell what's happening on the screen. Compared to an action game where you're one character and you have 5 orcs that are coming up to fight you. That's a much easier problem for 3D graphics to solve.
I think, an immersion is important in games for single player, even if you're not, considering multiplayer. So it's important. Like, look, the reason why this game sold so well, Age of Empires 2, is not just the gameplay; it's how it looks. It manages to immerse you in this amazing world while also being functional to the gameplay, and that's so it's so good. This is the reason why there's still 20,000 people playing this game. And when did it come out? Okay, this one's this is a remake technically, or a reissue. But when did Age of Empires 2 come out? 2000?
Oh God,
was it
Would have
before
been
that?
around there. I think a big part
Yeah.
of why people are around playing Age of Empires 2 as well now is the sheer amount of user created content, because they have a very robust map editor. And even back in the original version before they remastered it, I think there was a decent amount of custom content. And that's a big part of it, right? Because you can have your campaign, and then I think they added more campaigns and more civs when they remastered it as well. So the remastered has even more base content than the original. And then you've got, I haven't looked at it in a while. I have no idea how much user created content on there, but there's a hell of a lot of it. So I think that's a big part of it as well. It increases replayability massively, even on the single player or co-op side, as well as your multiplayer. So it's there's a lot of player options, and there's a lot of stuff for each option. Anything you want to do, there's just a smorgasbord of stuff to choose from.
Yeah, I'd like us to talk about some of the bad recent games too in a bit more detail. But before we shift, I just want to go through some of the sales numbers. These old classic games like Dawn of War 1 or Warhammer Dawn of War 1, that sold 7 million copies. Dawn of War 2 sold 4 million. I think the original Command and Conquer sold 3 million. Red Alert, 3 million. Homeworld 1, 3 million. I don't have numbers.
Folks. Just to put this into context, remember that the amount of people playing games then was so much smaller. So when Red Alert came out, that was... So I sort of see when Tomb Raider came out on the PlayStation, that game was made in my hometown, by the way. But when Tomb Raider came out, that was when, forgive the term, but that's when normies got interested in video gaming, okay? Before that, it was dead niche. So for you to sell 3 million copies of a game is absolutely wild. It's not like selling 3 million copies today. That's easy compared to how it was then. So these were big damn games. Conversely, there was less games to choose from, okay? So you were funneled towards, small, less games that were on the market, I guess. So there's that to consider as well.
Yeah. One of the things that's wild to me as we look at some of the games that did well, I think we want to shift to some of the ones that did badly too, but recent ones that did well. One of them, Warhammer Total War 2, it came out in a rough shape, but pretty quickly had huge critical acclaim. People loved it, played it a ton. But that sold like 3.5 million, which isn't that many compared to some of these older games. I mean, it's great they made a ton of... 3.5 million is a ton of money when you sell at a AAA price or close to it, It's a lot of money. You have a pretty big studio. Yeah.
It's almost enough. Well, maybe not.
But it's still, you would expect the market would be even bigger than that.
And that's an outlier, by the way. I'm still a bit squiffy about calling Total War an RTS. It technically is, but it's also, it's kind of a grand strategy game as well on top. And I know that we can argue over whether the grand strategy side of Total War is any good or not. But certainly, yeah, it's like Gladius being a 4X. It's kind of like, sort of. It's got elements of, but...
I was going to say, I think it's kind of sort of its own thing. They say it's a city builder or an economic sim or whatever. I don't know if they really have a clear definition. They're sort of in their own little category by themselves.
I didn't even consider Anno, that's another one that's very, just like Warhammer, it's very Total War, very close to the genre, but it's kind of its own thing. And I mean, Anno's unfeasibly popular as well.
Yeah. And I was just remembering before we go into the ones that have come out recently that haven't done so well, there were some real cult classics released back in the very early 2000s as well. We had a couple of studios sort of dip their toes into it. Ubisoft was one. They did World in Conflict, and they published Conquest Frontier Wars. So Conquest Frontier Wars was a space RTS, and it had a campaign and PvE, PvP matches. I actually used to play LAN games with my brother in the same house, and we had a really long, 30-meter long LAN cable. And we'd run it between the rooms and play co-op games of that. So that was a really cool one. That was from Ubisoft. Ground Control was from Sierra Entertainment. They don't do those anymore. I think they had two games, and then they dumped them. And then, World in Conflict, I actually played that last year for a little bit. That still holds up. That's an incredible game. So the campaign had a World War III scenario, basically, where Russia attacked the United States via the port of Seattle. and it ended up in this massive war, basically to stop the Russians from pushing too far into the United States. And then right at the end, they ended up getting repelled back off the border. But yeah, they were incredible games back in the day as well. And they became sort of cult classics. I don't think they're ever huge. I can't even find sales figures, but yeah, really good games in their own right as well.
Well, those days had amazing innovation. If you consider games like Battlezone, it was kind of a RTS, sort of. And then you had Myth: The Fallen Lords by Bungie, massive company at the time. And they'd just come out of doing Marathon, and then they just came out with this crazy real-time tactics game, which that was the first online game I played back in about 1998, I think. And I got dead addicted to that. I ran up so many phone bills on dial-up modem for AOL. I got in trouble. So yeah, the innovation back in the late 90s and early 2000s was wild. When StarCraft came along, though, that just kind of blew everything out of the water. And Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3. Anyway, over to you, Lucid, because we want to look at some of the games that haven't done quite so well, I think.
That have bombed.
Yeah.
So I think Homeworld 3, now I haven't actually played this, so I can't do a negative review on it, but
Same.
I feel like Homeworld 2 I'm like, Homeworld 2 was good, but I feel like in some ways it didn't even live up to the original. And Homeworld 3, you can see people just trash on it. Have any of y'all played it?
I have. I actually bought the collector's edition. Yeah, I'm one of those people. Hi.
Woof.
So I played, I think, about the first 3 or 4 missions of the campaign, and it didn't really do it for me. There was something about the originals. It kind of surprises me that Blackbird Interactive failed to recapture what was so great about the campaigns in the Homeworld games, because that's mostly what I play RTS for these days. Actually, I had more of a balance back in the day when I was playing them. I was sort of competitive, a bit of a low level, but nowadays it's more for the campaign. I just don't really have the sweatiness to keep up the competitive scene anymore. And a big part of the Homeworld campaigns was the vibe was a thing all on its own. Like, I remember you playing, one thing that always stuck with me was when you're playing the first Homeworld game, the voiceover and the narrative, the way the narrative cutscenes were, and then you got intel up in the screen with the little shadow. And it always got me that the VO was done in a way that sounded really professional. It didn't sound overdone. They sounded like they were actual professional naval personnel or something like that. And like, you have the thing where Igara gets destroyed, and you can hear it in their voices. You can hear it like their naval personnel trying not to crack, because they're just like, holy crap, our homeworld, just like where we live, just got destroyed, our home. And they're trying not to have a breakdown, because they're just like, we need to keep working, we need to keep moving, that kind of thing. And I remember that always stuck with me, because it was delivered so professionally and so well. And there's really none of that in Homeworld 3. It feels like they've just tried to go in a completely different direction. It doesn't make any sense to me, because Blackbird Interactive did Deserts of Carrick as well. And even though that was different, and they had the game, it was on the ground instead of in space, and there were things that were different, and the unit roster was a little limited and that sort of thing. I remember they released some DLC later on that I don't think did super well, but they still got the vibe right, and they still got the feel right. And then they've released this and then just completely crapped the bed with it. And the campaign, I didn't get very far in it. It didn't really do a lot for me, because it was kind of cool to start with, just because it looks pretty and everything sort of flows kind of nicely. And then you get in, and I started running into problems pretty early, because we had issues with pathfinding and targeting subsystems and that kind of thing, because you'd go in and it had introduced these missile corvettes. I think they're missile corvettes, I think they were. And then all you've got is your interceptors, and they go, okay, with the interceptors, target the engines. And you go, okay, cool. Well, how the hell am I supposed to do that? Because they just won't do it. They keep targeting them from the front, and they won't target the engines, which you're supposed to target the back of the ship. And it was just plagued with these kind of annoying issues that somehow the older ones never really had a problem with. So there was that. I think it was just flawed at such a deep level. And so the campaign was kind of a bust. And I didn't like the way they did the cutscenes, and they were focused on, it was instead of the more macro kind of scale, it was more of a micro kind of thing. Like, they focused on 1 or 2 characters instead of the entire civilization. So I didn't really like the change in that regard. And then also they leaned really hard into the war games, single player roguelike kind of thing. And that didn't really do well either, because you get in there and it just tries to rush you through every mission. And you have to get because I just died over and over again when I first got this, because I couldn't figure out what to do. And I was looking at it on the Steam forums, and basically every time you get into one of these missions, you need to rush. You go do whatever the objective is as quick as possible, and then you bail because you'll just keep getting swarmed. You get overwhelmed very quickly. There's no reward just for sticking around. There's no gradual build up. If you're there more than about 10 minutes, you'll just get crushed. And then they tried to lean into that, and they added in more factions and that kind of thing, but they never really did much to fix the core problems with the game. And then I think the reason in the end, this is why they're getting review bombed to hell at the moment. And it's partly to do supposedly with the way that Steam's changed their policies now around season passes, is from what I understand, they've essentially tried to cram all of next year's updates that they were going to do into one big DLC and then released it a few days ago. But the problem in doing that is that they've cut out some of the stuff apparently that's supposed to come out next year. So they're effectively not giving people stuff that they've paid for. And that's probably why you're seeing the reviews drop even more at the moment, because people are pissed and they got every right to be. So that was sort of the final nail in the coffin, really, for Homeworld 3, I think.
On my opening point a little bit, and I want to use this as an example, I am kind of convinced that the games development industry is kind of hemorrhaging talent, actually. And I don't think, regardless of the modern technology that we've got and the technological advancements we've had since the 90s and the early 2000s, I don't think the industry's actually got the talent anymore to be able to make a big game like this and pull it off, unless they are really, really, really focused on finding people who know how to put together an RTS game. Because look at Red Alert, the very first Red Alert. If you look at that opening cinematic where the scientist looking into the camera, and then the other guy's talking to him, shouts at him, steps back, goes and sits in the camera, and the whole thing's at this weird angle, so you can't quite see their faces. And then this guy he goes back in time, he meets Hitler, right in the opening scene, and then he takes Hitler with him, and he takes him out the game, and then so you have this crazy situation, and then so the next thing you see, you're with Stalin, and Stalin's giving you a mission, and every single line of that dialogue is perfect. It doesn't hit you with loads of exposition. Every single line of that dialogue is crafted to tell you what's going on. This guy is conflicting with her. She's kind of blowing off Stalin, like you are in trouble. They talk about gassing children and how long it takes for the children to die in the first thing, right? You can't do that now for a start. Yeah. It just would not wash, but they knew how to make the communists in that game look evil. They knew how to do it. Just single lines. And I watched cinematic. I haven't played Homeworld, so please understand that I'm talking, I'm theory crafting on this, but I've watched enough of the cinematics to know that there is just not the same level of understanding of cinema and impact. Oh yeah, in Red Alert as well. As soon as you come out of that first cinematic, you get hit with Death March. What's it called? That iconic piece of music from Red Alert, and it's just like the most.
I know what you're
it hits. Yeah. It hits you like a ton of bricks. Yeah. And it's just one of the most amazing things. That game was crafted to hit you like a ton of bricks. You could not be anything but engaged and immersed from 3 minutes of cinematic footage. And then it sends you straight into the game. None of this bullshit that you get now where I get like, Shaun, can I ask you a question about Homeworld 3? How long does it take to get through all the tutorials and all the cinematics before you get to some really engaging gameplay? How long?
Oh boy. I know there's the intro cinematic and then tutorial. Oh geez, I don't know, about 20 minutes or so, something like that. I can't really remember.
And usually it's about the length. It's usually the length of time that it takes for the Steam refund window to end. Yeah. So that's usually what happens with these games at the moment. So I'm quite surprised.
Ben was telling me about this conspiracy theory yesterday that people are putting in the right amount of time of content, like before you find out that the core game sucks, so that you miss the Steam refund window.
Yeah, I mean, that is a conspiracy theory. It's more like they just try to ease you into these games, really, really gently. Everything's got to be easy. There's no difficulty, really. They don't want people to get, because they aim these games mostly at casual players. The vast majority of people who buy games now, 90% of the people who buy these games, they play for 20 hours, hopefully leave a thumbs up on Steam, and then they go and play the next cool game that gets recommended to them on the Steam store. Yeah. So in an attempt to convert more, to get more of those kind of people, because that's the biggest market, more casuals, more kind of normie gamers, you have to make the games easy, kind of lame, sort of slow paced. Don't challenge them too much, and that filters into the rest of the game design. And if you read the reviews of Homeworld 3, you will see that there is some evidence in that, I think, to back up what I'm saying a little bit. The game's quite slow at the start. I think people were a little bit disappointed with some of the gameplay. Like Shaun said, it did not help that it was riddled with technical issues. But Lucid, can you tell us about some of the problems with RTS? Because I think this is a good segue.
Yeah.
Because I think that RTS is flawed in the sense but you tell us anyway.
Yeah, sure. I think this highlights one of the things about RTS is to design an RTS, it's very technical. And when you look at like MOBAs came out of StarCraft and Warcraft 3, Dota is a Warcraft 3 mod. And why did the person who developed Dota do it as a mod to Warcraft instead of making their own game from scratch? The reason is because Warcraft 3 solved a bunch of problems that are actually not easy to solve. Having good pathfinding. When units do attack move, it feels really good. When units attack, they're attacking the right distance from each other, and the hits and the swings all line up well. And when they're moving, it's not just pathfinding A to B, because you also have to take into account you're moving this huge blob. And when you're moving a blob through a funnel, you want the blob to go through the funnel, unless it's really bad, and then maybe it spills out the sides. But games that have bad pathfinding and they go way around, like people start routing to the other side of the map and they get picked off by the enemy. It's so annoying. And so there's a huge technical challenge to designing these games well. And if you don't solve that, maybe you want to have a game where you can attack engines, because that's something you want to be in Homeworld, but you don't put it in well, or it doesn't work well. It's really frustrating. And I think in general, when you think about an RTS, it's really this fantasy of being a general in an army and controlling this army. And that's the power fantasy. Oh God, I can control this huge army. I can do these cool tactics and things like that and really outsmart my opponent. Well, the general doesn't tell every soldier what to do. The general tells their lieutenants, okay, you move here, you move here. And it's an efficient way to run a thing. If a general had to tell every unit in the army what to do, the army wouldn't do anything. And so I think when you're looking at how RTSs work, you need systems in the RTS game that let you do what you want to and make it feel intuitive. And you move armies around and it feels great and intuitive, and combat feels great and intuitive. And these are not trivial problems. It's not like an out-of-the-box solution that feels great. If it was, then we wouldn't have all these games releasing with bad mechanics. So,
well, is it that we used to be able to do it and we can't do it? Sorry to interrupt. I want to, because like I said with the cinematics, for example, I feel that we've just looking at the cinematics from modern games and how they were done in the past, it was clear that the people who made these cinematics were drawing from a broader and more rich era of cinema and craftsmanship in order to get to get people engaged and immersed. Whereas if you go and look at the intro to Homeworld Deserts of Karak, for example, quite an interesting intro, but it's just exposition. Yeah, it's mostly exposition. What was brilliant about the original Homeworld was Homeworld, the original one, like Shaun said, it just drew you in with just the voice acting and the radio chatter. I thought that was fantastic. But with the mechanics, we've had, with the technical side of it, developers have had 30 years now, getting on 30 years to kind of solve these issues. I know, sure, the technology gets bigger. The technology advances, but these are still, things like pathfinding, the way that units realistically flock together and move as a group, that kind of stuff that just comes out broken. I mean, if you played Dune Spice Wars, that game was kind of cool, but it had the worst pathfinding, and it was just broke. It's still, I think it's still broken. They never fixed it. So I do think it backs up my point that I don't think the talent is what it was. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to games developers. I mean, I work for a developer, and I know how hard people work on these games. I'm not gleeful about Homeworld 3. I'm devastated for that developer. I'm devastated for them. It must have been absolutely appalling to see how badly this did. But I think that we are in an era where people think they know better. They think that, they've got all these cool ideas and trendy modern stuff, but they don't know how to craft a good game, for the most part.
With the technical stuff, absolutely agree. That obviously can make or break a game, but things like pathfinding in particular are absolutely critical. And I remember Brandon Castile, I think he's the lead dev or something working on Tempest Rising. There was a comment about in one of the demo builds about how the pathfinding was a little bit wonky. It was pretty solid, actually. It wasn't 100%, but it was pretty good. And someone made a complaint about it, and he sort of went, it's pathfinding, from what I understand, is incredibly difficult to get right. Having all of your units autonomous and figure out the correct way to go is really, really hard to do. And they were iterating on it. But even then, in a demo, that game crapped all over the technical parts of most of the newer RTSs that I've tried. And if, just as a little aside, if you go and look up Iron Harvest at the moment, it has more players than Homeworld 3. If anyone wants to go and check that, it'll probably still be the same thing. But but both of them had similar sort of technical problems, right? They're going for that narrative story driven campaign and then having replayable PvE modes, which is a really good idea. But then they've got these massive issues, particularly with pathfinding and response time, and general AI behaviors just don't work. Iron Harvest, there was always a really big lag time with response to commands that you put. You'd tell a unit to move or turn around and shoot at something, and it'd be a solid half a second to a second before they'd turn around and actually do something. It was really annoying. And then pathfinding, you'd have units get bogged down and take off in the wrong direction. And then you're fighting the game as much as you're fighting the other players. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of an anecdote about why this stuff is so critical, but there was a game that came out about, I can't remember now, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, called A Year of Rain. And I bought a copy of that. And it was the campaign that they had, that was from Data Lake Entertainment. And it was a really solid campaign driven RTS, kind of like a Warcraft 3 sort of style. And sort of like how it works with Warcraft 3, you had the main character he had this, I can't remember exactly what was going on, but he was basically trying to expand his kingdom or something. And he was in this war with the dwarves. I think it was dwarves. And then during that process, he went from being like this paragon to being this tyrannical dictator, and had this massive change. It was a really well done campaign. I would have loved to see what they did with the rest of it. But the problem with that was the pathfinding was absolutely garbage. There was a mission, you have one of those missions in RTSs where you'll have a limited amount of units and you're trying to accomplish an objective to get more units. It's pretty classic staple, right? So you'd be running along and I remember there was a creek with a broken tree over it, and you'd have to cross the tree, use it as a bridge to get across this creek. The units would actually fall off the tree and clip into the creek, and you couldn't move. That just completely kills it. And the thing is, these guys knew that pathfinding was no good when they launched it. And they launched it anyway, hoping to make money, and that they were going to use the funds to fix it up like they promised. That's the most major thing we're going to work on is the pathfinding. But it sold so poorly because of the bugs in the pathfinding that they just canned it altogether. And that was a really promising game. So it just proves how absolutely crucial things like these technical features are to the success of the game.
Yeah, I'll just show this kind of as a thought experiment for one of the reasons why pathfinding's hard. Let's say this is your unit, and let's say there's big rocks here that are obstructing things, and you want them to go here, and you got this big blob of an army. The fastest path for all of them might be this way, right? Where this is the straight line path, so they should all go inside. But as they move, the formation hits it, we all know intuitively they should spill around the side, because that's going to be the fastest way for them to go, is they should go like this. And then at some point they're spilling around the sides and going here because that's the fastest way to get there. So we know as humans what the intuitive way for these guys to go. And if they all bunched up here and slowly go through the middle, that would be annoying, but it's at least predictable, right? But then if you have, okay, well, we should solve the fastest thing. And what happens is, like, once the guys are here, the blob is now here, and you said, okay, we're not going to have them go around the side. Or maybe you do have them go around the side, but this unit here, which is looking like, hey, where can I go? He's like, hey, this is clogged up. I can't go this way at all. I'm going to have to go around the side. What if the side here, instead of these blue little rocks being small, what if they're huge? What if this goes way across the screen? That's when you get this guy. He's like, okay, this way's blocked. I have to go this way. And so he starts marching all the way around the map to die. These are not simple problems. And and it matters on a ton of different things. Do you want, if you have tanks in your game, do you want your tanks to have a radius at which they can turn, or do they turn on a dime? So, and then you start mixing that in. Okay, well, the tank has to have pathfinding, but also has a minimum radius of turn. And then you want these guys, if these guys were zombies move in a straight line. They go like the bird flies, and they're all going towards a certain thing. But that's not how humans move. Humans move as a spaced out formation. And so all these things, you start doing this poorly. You don't even know it when you're playing the game, but they're immersion breaking because you're like, wait, humans don't move like this. And that's one of the things StarCraft 2 did great is when you move Marines in StarCraft 2 and Zerglings, it's so satisfying. Marines with the attack move, if you watch pros play, they do the stutter step backwards. It's so satisfying. It's really responsive. And then if you look at Zergs, you attack somebody, the Zergs automatically surround the units they're attacking. Like it feels like you really are controlling this swarming horde.
So
And these things
you never
don't
think
happen
about
naturally.
Yeah. Sorry, Lucy. It's the sort of things you never think about as a gamer, but you don't realize just how difficult that is to get looking as cool as that.
And it's like you want these intelligent solutions. Like you want the solution where the guys behave intuitively, they go around the big rocks. Right. But you don't want, if somebody puts in an intelligent solution and it's not done really, really well, it feels horrible because then you have guys like mapping around the other way, the halfway around the map. So putting in smart things that make you feel like a general because people aren't like units and squads are behaving like units and squads and it's intuitive. That's really hard to do well. And if you don't do it well, it's worse than if you just said, no, we're just going to have people move in a straight line from A to B.
Yep.
So.
By the way, if you're interested in this topic, I think he's called the 8-bit guy. He made this computer called the Commander X16, which is kind of like a modern version of a sort of Commodore 64. It uses the MOS 6581 processor. So it's an 8-bit machine with an 8-bit processor. He made a modern style RTS that's very much like Dune 2, I guess. And he made that on an 8-bit machine. And, he was talking in the community, like, how do I get I'm struggling with the pathfinding. And everyone's like, well, we'll just use A star. Now, if you know anything about mathematics, you'll understand that A star is not that easy to do on an 8-bit processor. Okay. So he came up with some really ingenious ways to get this really, kind of old school machine, having units that don't just charge off going round, like Lucid said, when you've got these long detours that they have to go off. He just started throwing things like little random choices in and stuff. If it can't get to where it's going, it just makes a random choice. And then that often fixed it, right? So there is technical things that you can do. The thing is, unless you've come from that era where you are used to overcoming problems on really, really limited hardware, like today, for example, we've got these computers with incredible power, but a lot of developers didn't grow up in that era. So they don't have that mindset where they're trying to figure out how to do things the most efficiently they can. So they immediately just kind of, this is why you get real big problems with games poorly optimized, because they're like, oh, I've got this computer, I've got this massively powerful computer. I'm just going to use Unity and, we'll throw in all these, A star, crazy algorithms and all this kind of stuff. And then what you don't realize is that a lot of other people's computers can't run that. So you end up with it just being really, really crap. So again, I mean, I'm belaboring the point, but I think, you know what I mean? I think people...
No, I think if there were good out-of-the-box solutions for some of these things, then there would be a lot better strategy games and there'd be more of them, or RTS games. But there's not. And that's why you see MOBAs weren't developed by an indie developer doing their own game. They were developed as a mod on the backs of people who solved these. Like the fact that Blizzard solved all those technical problems for Warcraft 3 and you as a modder could just come in and make content. Like people don't appreciate how big of a deal that was. That's a huge deal. Like you can't be the guy who made Dota. If he did it as an independent game, people would have review bombed the shit out of it. And they would have been like, oh, it's got really bad bugs, bad pathfinding, bad mechanics, all the things, So I think that's the thing. And so you get a 400 person, 500 person game studio and they're using an engine and they want to use they want to use the stuff the engine has, but the engine might have a bad pathfinding thing. I mean, I think the thing is you have to you need really good coders. That's really what it comes down to. And really good coders doesn't just mean you can code. It means you understand algorithm efficiency and things like that. And you're willing to tinker with it until it feels right.
Yeah, you either need a computer scientist or you need, a time-served programmer who did stuff in machine code, in assembly language or whatever. Someone who's really, really just knows how to think around these problems.
That's hardcore, man.
Well, I don't know. I think
that's very hardcore. The machine code. But,
yeah. I mean, machine code is. I mean, but I'm exaggerating the point. But what I mean is, I think the longer you've been doing this, the more you think, especially if you've been working on limited hardware. This is what I mean. I feel like the talent is diluting, and a lot of the greatest talent, particularly in programming, these guys move up into managerial jobs and they become producers and this kind of thing. So they're often sat there, assigning people jobs on Jira, rather than actually getting,
Right.
like passing on their technical skills. That's kind of what I mean when I say that the talent is changing, and the way that we have skills or acquire skills and use them is changing over the years. And sometimes it's kind of one step forward, two steps back. In other ways, we've come on a long way. I'm not denying that, but the point is RTS is hard. That's the point. It's really, really hard.
Yeah, it's got a pretty demand. Like, I mean, if you compare it to making a card battler or something, it's just way more technically demanding. If you want to make Slay the Spire or something, it's a great game. Like, you need to be a good game designer, right? But you don't need to solve really complicated technical problems the same way. So this is a Year of Rain. This is one of the other. So this is a quote unquote bad game, right? It was, I think, an early access game that got released in the past 5 years, kind of was abandoned. I think you played this, right, Shaun?
I can't believe that's still for sale. I just saw that. I was like, wow. But yeah, no, I did play that.
90% off, $1.50.
But they're not making it anymore. They abandoned it. How can you keep selling something that you're never going to continue to work on? That's crazy. Anyway, yeah.
It's a fun question. The other big one I think that came out recently that was a huge bomb was Stormgate. And this was a weird game, man. This was so weird. It had like weird funding issues. You could pay early to get an early release for a free-to-play game. And it wasn't much earlier, and then it bombed kind of during the early release part. There were a bunch of technical issues, so you really couldn't play it until it became free to play. So that kind of left a bad taste in people's mouth. And then the campaigns and missions, there was kind of weird monetization for how they were trying to fund the free to play game. You would pay for campaigns and missions, but they were bad and short.
Just look at that blurb. Look at the blurb they've got. Frost Giant aims to build the next great RTS. Why are you selling it if you've not already done that? That bugs me. Look at that. That bugs me. And I know
it's early access.
Access? I don't know.
Isn't this one of those ex-Blizzard studios?
This is.
Yeah.
When you look at who they got, though, they didn't get the head programmer. I think they got the head graphic. We can look at who it was, but they got the head graphic artist, and I think maybe one of the marketing people. Oh, I'm going to say it wrong. We should probably look it up. I'll look it up on my stream. But yeah, I think this game it looked worse than StarCraft 2. It mechanically was worse than StarCraft 2. And it's weird little things. Like units didn't feel as good to move. They didn't feel as good to attack when you were using them in combat.
That's all stuff that's hard to do as well, man. The feel, how a game feels.
Yeah.
That also takes experience, I'm sure.
But it's also kind of ugly. This just visually looks a lot worse than StarCraft 2. And there's a lot of people didn't like the art style either, which is this weird cartoony thing. It's kind of serious cartoons, if that's everything's round and bubbly, but it's also sort of like grim, dark feel. Kind of weird.
Like a grim, dark mobile game or cell phone game.
Yeah. It does have a bit of a mobile game feel.
Yeah.
But this was pumped as being like Blizzard people. It's going to be the new stuff. Because, Blizzard abandoned StarCraft 2 to a degree. There's a community council that balances and updates the games. They had a big patch the other day, but I don't think Blizzard hosts the esport events for it anymore.
That's an old game now. I mean, how old is StarCraft 2? It's got to be like 2008 or something, wasn't it? Or
yeah, it's old.
It's old. People still play it. Oh, it's a classic. I mean, people are still playing a game after nearly 20 years or whatever it is, and it's probably a good game.
Yeah. I think this also is a pretty good example of kind of bad 3D art. I think this would be way prettier as 2D. Like, what is happening back here? What is this unit? What is this unit? You need to play the game to be trained to know what a lot of these are. You don't just look at it and know. So, but these things are really hard to do well in 3D.
I feel you could probably
a strategy game.
I feel you could level maybe the same criticism at something. I was playing Total Annihilation today, and remembered, I've got Beyond All Reason as well. So I reinstalled Beyond All Reason, which is kind of like a modern remake of Total Annihilation, essentially. And I guess you could level the same sort of critique at that. You look at it, it's like, what does this robot do? What does that one? They all kind of look similar. And, once you know the game, I see the point. I actually think that it's hard to see because it's a little bit blurry for me actually on the screen here, but I feel like the graphics, it looks closer to Age of Empires 2 than it does to StarCraft 3 to me, this does. It looks like stuff's kind of distinct and clear at least. I don't know if that's just because of maybe the StarCraft 2 screenshots we were looking at where stuff was all clumped together. I feel like at least it looks kind of, more.
There's also kind of bad art design here. Where this is other weird things you don't necessarily think about, but like the background is about the same brightness or exposure value level as a lot of the units. So the units don't really stand out here. I mean, they will on other backgrounds more, but those are things that make games readable well. This is nice in the sense that, like, usually you want the spell effects to be a lot brighter than the units and a lot brighter than the background. And this nails it. You're like, oh man, that's a really powerful beam. But, here it's much less. And then here it's the spell effects and the background and the units are all sort of the same color. So it doesn't feel very good. It's like, why does this not feel good when you look at it? And why does this feel really good when you look at it? So
it's just sort of inconsistent.
Yeah. You need to think about all these things when you make a game. And it affects readability too. Like how easy is it to play?
I mean, these guys came from Blizzard, right? They've got a pedigree. Now, which era of Blizzard did they come from? That's a good question. Because it's like, they came from Blizzard. Did they make StarCraft 1 or Warcraft 2?
Yeah, I don't know how much we want to do with Frost Giant assassination here, but
no, that's not my intention either. But I just mean, kind of, it's interesting because it's a shame because, really, if they've got that much talent and the game's just not come out very well, maybe it was rushed out early, or there's so many reasons why games can bomb as well that are nothing to do with the RTS genre. I think a lot of the things that I've been talking about today, I think you could probably level them at other genres just as much. I think the technical issues are very much an RTS thing for sure.
Yeah. We have to go through each of them. I've got them all pulled up here, but yeah, I don't know if we want to do that. Pull each of the people. That's probably a little too personal.
Yeah, maybe so. We're not out to hurt anybody's feelings. But.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think this one's important because there was actually a lot of hype around it. The StarCraft 2 community was pretty big and they got everybody hyped up. And then the hype kind of backfired. Nobody wanted to say anything nice, or nobody wanted to say anything mean, but nobody could say anything nice. So, yeah. So the other one that was, of course, a complete bomb was Warcraft 3 Reforged. They just this was such a huge disaster.
Guys, you know what? I don't like remakes and remasters. I just don't care. If the old game's good, why bother? I'm of the mind that only remake games that are bad. Because if you remake bad games, then you can make them better. But if the game is already a classic like Warcraft 3 was, what was the need? It's just there to make money. That's the only reason they do it.
No, man, come on. Well, like Age of Empires 2, that was like an amazing remake. It revitalized the franchise.
And so Warcraft 3 should have been a slam dunk. Like you'd redo it like with the Age of Empires 2, right? You do it, you'd maybe upscale the graphics a bit, make it look a bit nicer, make it work on more modern resolutions. You don't have to really change a lot of things, just make them look a bit nicer and modernize them a bit, bring it up to current standards. And then you'd have your campaign, same as it was, maybe fix a couple of bugs if there are any bugs that never got fixed. That's it. And then you wrote your nice map editor, bring everything forward, improve things. This is what Age of Empires 2 did. And then they even added in new civilizations and stuff, like I was saying before. Like they added extra content that fit the game when they relaunched it. They absolutely killed it with Age of Empires 2. So all they needed to do was that.
Yeah.
Should have been a home run, and they just stuffed it at every level. Like it came out, it had a heap of technical issues. It was something about the unit the unit portraits. I think something with the units talking was out of place. The multiplayer scene wasn't there. It took a couple of years for them to have a ladder system and a properly functioning multiplayer system. And then the big one that got them a lot of backlash was with your map creator. So they had the map creation tools, but in the original one, as we were talking about before, how you got Dota was they would work, people made their own maps and their own custom content. And then you had genres created out of it. It was awesome. It was incredible, the things that these people come up with. So what they did in Warcraft Reforged, Blizzard had the really good idea, I'm guessing because they didn't want that to happen again, in their EULA, or their terms of service or whatever it was, they said any custom content that you make is owned by Blizzard. You don't own the rights to it. You can't take it with you. You can't make a whole new genre out of it. Blizzard owns it. And that just completely killed the community goodwill. So yeah, no, that should have been an absolute home run, and they just fucked it.
You can't lose harder than they lost. I mean, they were the completionist or whatever, right? Where you're trying to complete 100% of the game. But they have to get every single achievement for failing. You know, it was a horrible buggy launch. They also made it so that, because you could play Warcraft 3 before, right? But they made it once they launched Reforged, you couldn't even play the original Warcraft 3. Like you
What?
had to
Really?
play Reforged.
And
And
this
they
is what I
launched it
mean.
and you couldn't do custom maps. So when they first, everybody who was a Warcraft 3 fan and liked playing custom maps, when they launched Warcraft 3 Reforged, you just couldn't play custom maps anymore.
Yeah,
They just
they've gone
like
soft in the
killed
head.
half the game immediately. Like, welcome.
Blizzard have
with
gone
that
soft in
original
the head.
version thing. With that original version thing, so I own the original discs for Warcraft 3 and Warcraft 3 Frozen Throne, right? I've never registered them on Blizzard. If you had them registered on Blizzard and then you got Warcraft 3 Reforged, it overwrote the original Warcraft 3 on your Blizzard client. I don't know if they ever got around to fixing that, but there was a huge drama around that because like you lost your original copies of the game and they pushed this instead. So there you go, another fail.
Yeah.
That's outrageous. I think some of these developers have just publishers and stuff. They've just got so greedy that they're. I don't think they understand that a little bit of goodwill goes a really long way. But you only have to make one bad game like this with such terrible, terrible, greedy decisions behind it, and you are done. You are done. I mean, I think
I don't think so.
I don't know.
Look at Blizzard, man. They've made so many bad games.
Yeah,
Like,
but look,
they've broken goodwill so repeatedly.
But that is really greedy. I'm sorry. I've never heard. I mean, Blizzard have made some dumb mistakes, but Jesus, that is. I didn't know this story, by the way. I didn't really pay much attention to it because I just don't care about remasters. I'm just not. What's wrong with the original? That's my point. Okay, yeah, it doesn't work maybe it doesn't work on some people's computers, and it's nice to be able to play in modern resolutions and stuff. But really, I just don't. Paid no attention.
I think it's great. I think if you nail a remaster, if you upscale everything, there's a lot of things too that it's like also knowing tastefully which modern additions to make. Really old games, when they got remastered, they added building queues and control groups and things, like some of the really early stuff that they remastered. So it's like some quality of life things, adding them in, fixing old bugs, and mostly, but just making it have a better look and feel.
Yeah, fair enough. I think if they don't mess around with the game too much, that's my issue. It's like when Muhar did that Master of Magic remake, and it just wasn't quite the old one, but it wasn't quite new either. It's just sort of half-assed, halfway between. Just like Just
well, Master Magic also has the problem that you're going, in that case, from bad 2D to sort of bad 3D.
Yeah, I mean, it never looked good in 2D.
If they just went to good 2D, it would have been huge, I think.
Yeah. I talk about this a lot, but the homogenization of gaming, to try to bring things up, because modern gamers expect 3D graphics because 3D is newer than 2D, right? Three's a higher number than 2, so that must be better.
Yeah.
And I just think that I just don't get that. And by the way, just a quick aside. Do you remember when we were talking about how early 3D games kind of look bad? And, you compare them to sort of like 2D games, like the very earliest 3D games. If you want a really good indicator of this, look at the difference between Wizardry 7, which came out in 1994, I think, or 93, and then Wizardry 8, which was kind of crapped out in 2000 or 2001. And look at the difference in the visuals between a game that came out like 7 years before, and then this really kind of new modern 3D game that came out. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. Like Wizardry 7's got some of the most beautiful 2D graphics, and then Wizardry 8 was just like, watch Seth Zintach's video and you'll see what I mean. It's just goofy.
Best 2D graphics? I don't know. I mean,
it's got some of the most beautiful pixel art, man. I mean, at least in the design of the monsters, in the combat, it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good.
I would say this is just mostly a side grade. Yeah. I think a good example of this actually is the old Disciples games. If you remember those, they had,
Yeah.
this is now we're going into deep rabbit trail, but if you look at Disciples 2, I think it had beautiful 2D graphics. And do we have, so this is the combat, pretty readable.
Yeah,
know?
look at that, man. That's pretty good.
You kind of see the units here, but then they did the new Disciples and it was fully 3D. And
Have you played that one? Disciples Liberation?
yeah. All right, whoops. And a lot of these scenes, you can't, let's see if they have combat. You can't tell what this is. Like, what the fuck is this? This actually is a dragon or something.
It's the arse end of a
it's
zombie
really,
dragon.
yeah, these are actually hard to read. They're these high textured things that are hard to tell what it is. Like, what is this? And you can kind of, if I told you it's a knight, you can say, oh, here's the horse head. Readability is something that's harder to do in a 3D game because when you're doing a 2D thing, you're controlling the lighting because you're drawing it. When it's a 3D game, whatever you see on the screen isn't something the artist said, this is what I want you to see. It's a result of what lighting you have in the scene, the material that the things are made of, how the lights and the material interact, and then how you've colored it and all the texture. It's this emergent thing. And you don't know what background it's going to be in front of. So you don't know how the edges are going to do anyway. But
No, okay, that's a good point.
sorry.
No. I mean, just one more very quick example would be the difference between the old Solium Infernum by Cryptic Comet and the remake that was made recently. Got like the original's got some of the, again, it's really, really beautiful hand-drawn artwork. And the guys who, by the way, the game itself, the remake was pretty good.
Oh, wait, this is the new one.
Yeah, but look at the graphics.
Oh, people did not like the art very much.
Yeah, look at it. It looks like Wallace and Gromit. It's like Aardman Animation did Dante's Inferno. It's just, look at that. This looks retarded. What the hell is that supposed to be? It was so disappointing because they did a reasonably good, they did a pretty damn good job of the game's design on that game. And you can tell they loved the original game as well. You can tell that. They weren't just saying it. You could tell. But the art director just needed, they needed a different art director on that game. It didn't even, it wasn't even consistent either. The artwork just wasn't consistent. If you look at some of the faction characters in it looked pretty good. Whereas, they looked better than the others, whereas some just looked really, really bad. I'm sorry, we're getting a bit sidetracked from RTS, but I think it's an interesting point.
With that Solium Infernum, I think they're done with support on that too. It didn't, because the studio had massive funding problems. They had 2 games in the works. They had to can one of them because they lost so much funding. And they went with this one. They had Jump Light Odyssey, I think was the other one, and they went with Solium Infernum instead. And I think now that also has not made them enough money to keep working on it or keep functioning as a studio. So I think they've gone dormant or closed down. But yeah, they've had to end support on this as well because it didn't do as well as they were hoping.
Well, they were done. I don't know how these,
even before it was released,
they did a DLC.
Done. Oh, they sold well. 19. The game sold well.
The game sold well, but the DLC doesn't look like it did.
Oh no! Well,
19 reviews on a DLC.
Yeah, that isn't good. But yeah, League of Geeks they were basically.
I played this though. This was a fun game.
Yeah, it's really good. The original's better, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I think.
Okay.
Well, I don't know actually, because I think that League of Geeks did tie up some of the stuff that was kind of broken in the first game, I guess. So, but for me, I know I go on about how I don't really care about graphics, but I think I'm lying. I think I do. I think like when graphics are really bad, to the point where you're playing this battle for the throne of hell, yeah, and then you've got Shaun the Sheep as one of the characters, like fucking Wallace and Gromit or whatever. It takes me out of it, man. It takes me out of it big time.
Yeah. I think one other thing we need to talk about before we move on from the game, I think we have to talk about Total War Warhammer 3. Because this also, I don't want to say this was
it was a shocking release, and Creative Assembly dropped the ball, I'm afraid. And leaving a game in that state and not updating it for, what was it, 2 months? No, that really pissed everybody off.
Yeah,
that really pissed people off. It's a good game now, by the way. It's a pretty good game.
Just dropped the ball in chat. Sorry.
Oh yeah, it looks like got recent reviews are pretty good, almost 90.
Yeah, well, with that and Pharaoh, CA dropped the ball really hard in general, and then it took a lot of community backlash to really turn the ship around because they had essentially dumped Pharaoh. It didn't look like they were going to do anything with that, and then Total War Warhammer 3, they launched it, they took forever to patch it up, and then it still wasn't really where it was supposed to be. And then they started releasing these DLCs that had worse value every time. You were getting less and less and paying more for it. And the community backlash eventually got to the point where they started review bombing the game. They started going after the developers, and they just started going really crazy with it. This massive circle jerk of hyperbole going on. And eventually the developers finally realized, like CA finally realized, hey, I think we might have stuffed up here. And then they've turned around and they've gained back a lot of goodwill because their next 2 DLCs were just absolute bangers for Warhammer 3.
Okay.
And they started launching these really meaty patches. And then Pharaoh as well, they brought out Dynasties. That was a free update that was essentially half of a game. Well, you couldn't even really call it a DLC.
It's almost a new game. Yeah, it's almost a new game. They released it for free, so that was good. I think they needed to do that, and the fact that they were able to do that after wasting £200 million on hyenas. They built a studio just for that game and trying to run and paying.
What is this game, Hyenas? Is it on Steam?
Shaun, I don't know. Oh yeah, I think it was originally meant to be sort of a hero shooter. They were chasing the hero shooter thing, like Overwatch and that kind of thing, and they got a fair way in. I think they were doing alpha testing or something, and then they canned it because I'm guessing
£200 million they spent on it. Apparently, they built a studio just for that game, and they hired a lot of people. Now, I watched this guy called The Great Book of Grudges, Nathan, and he said that it was his understanding that Creative Assembly had somewhere between 800 and 900 employees at the time of Warhammer 3's release. Just to put it into perspective, I used to work for a games developer called Eurocom, which made James Bond, Harry Potter, the Olympics, official Olympics games. So they were a big developer, and they did big franchises based in the UK. And they had about 150 to 200, I think, at the height. And about 10% of the staff were QA. That was like 20 people in the QA department I was working in for a bit. So yeah, what are they doing with 900 people? What are you doing with 900 people in a games developer?
No, it's not hard to figure out. I mean, have you played Total War Warhammer 2? Like
I have, but 900 people.
If you watched Mandalar Gaming's review of it, they have little cracks in the city, and in the cracks they put all these buildings and stuff. I mean, and the units, the models, they're so detailed. The animations are great,
made with love. There's no doubt about it. Apparently the animators used to stay voluntary overtime just to put more sync animations.
Sync kills,
sync kills. Yeah, that's the one. So I believe that's true, and I think you can tell. Total War Warhammer 3 is a pretty good game now. I think the strategic side of it is a little bit still not great. Some people think that Warhammer 2 is still a better game. To be honest, since I've had my really serious game critic head on, I haven't played either of them enough to be able to make a decision. But I think I got more fun out of Warhammer 2. But I do like some of the factions.
I think there's some big problems in Warhammer, like
the strategic game's kind of crap.
I think you should start off with cooler units. I feel like in general, it's just making lots of shitty unit armies until very late in the campaign, because it takes a long time to get buildings. And a lot of times the better ones aren't necessarily better. It's often better to have big armies of shitty units.
And the game's kind of over by turn 50 most of the time anyway. If you're a good player.
And you kind of have to have it that way, because they have a multiplayer scene. And if just having the higher tier units made you win more, then you wouldn't use the low tier units. Right. And then the multiplayer, you just pick your starting army, and that's what you're going to take in. So they have to like balance it around that. And then it's in the campaign, though, you have to spend $1 bajillion to upgrade your structures to make the high tier units. And then you're playing with the boring low tier units. Like, no, dude, give me like some fucking toys in my starting army. Let me play with those guys.
I think that
don't give me the best units, but give me, if I want to, let me spend some money. Let me make some cool shit. Early. Like, don't make me have to build. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, part of the problem I think with that game is that it requires you to have some element of restraint with the way that you play, because it is a sandbox game. And I think with sandbox games, it's closer towards the sandbox game, if you're looking at sandbox versus kind of pressure or puzzle based gameplay. and you need to make your own fun in it, right? If you are a min-max player and you are unable to control yourself from using all the most powerful, optimal strategies, you're gonna just get run out of fun with Warhammer pretty fast because there are obviously you're just running around. You see Legend of Total War, the way that he's learned to break that game, and because he plays on the highest difficulty, so you kind of need to.
Yeah, it's not fun. He sits there with his hero and just wasting all their ammo.
It's just a stupid
game.
And
then he's like, yeah, you can't. Yeah, and he's also on higher difficulty. You can't use melee units because their stats are so much better than yours. So you have to do range.
That was fixed in Warhammer 3, actually, but Warhammer 2 was really bad for that because melee units were just unviable on legendary difficulty. I just don't play it on that. It's just not fun for me. So I challenge myself with difficulty in different ways. So yeah, it's a very odd game. It's one of those games where there's some really good criticism of the modern Total War games by a guy called Voland. He's kind of a challenging person to follow, I'll be honest, but his critique of Total War is pretty good when he's sticking to his point. And I think that, for example, you can beat whole armies in Warhammer by sending a monster or a powered up hero into a blob of troops and then hitting them with artillery from behind. I know it's not supposed to be realistic, but it just breaks the immersion of the game. It's just stupid. So I think it's just a bit of a weird game. It's a bit of a weird game. It's big dumb fun is the way I look at it. It's bombastic. It looks beautiful. It's fun, but I wouldn't pick that as it's not a serious strategy game in my opinion.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. I don't think. See, was it Total War Rome had just come out when I first found out about the Total War games, and I sort of dipped in and out. But I don't really remember the early ones very well. But the Warhammer games in particular, I don't think you'd play them like you say. It's like a hardcore strategy game. It's more about the spectacle, the ridiculous battles. Like I remember from Warhammer 2, I was playing as what are they, lizard men? And you could have cannons that basically like launch miniature suns at your enemies. And I was like, that's awesome. But, it's not a super serious, grounded game. And I don't know if it's really meant to be honest. You can't really play it as one. But that's the main thing I do with it as well. Like I will not play it on a high difficulty. I'll put it on a low to medium difficulty. And it's just fun to go around and build crazy units and ruffle stomp people on the battlefield. And I tried out like the new hero, Elspeth, with all the artillery units and rifle schools and that kind of thing. And it's just so fun to bully people with hailstorm rocket artillery and that kind of thing. So yeah, no, it is kind of its own thing, but yeah, I think it's more about the spectacle than actually playing it seriously.
It's a fantastic story build, organic storyline builder in that respect. Kind of works like Dominion's a little bit like that. It's cool. Really
I think
cool.
In that way, Total War leans, because I think there's a conflict between like having this really cool power fantasy with really cool units that do really cool things and having boring shit that's balanced for multiplayer. And I think pretty much across the board, like when you look at one of people's favorite strategy games is Heroes of Might and Magic 3, which is, it's so busted. The way you win multiplayer games is depending on which completely, utterly broken degenerate strategy you pick. I'm going to do the strategy where I can teleport around the map and take every town in a single turn.
But it's
right? Or
fun.
no, I'm going to do the strategy where I hit you with or Armageddon every turn until your army's dead.
Yeah.
And I'll just keep buying my hero back.
But that's compelling single-player gameplay, right? That's compelling single-player gameplay, whereas modern games...
I love that shit.
Yeah, it's great. And, if you want to play it competitively, you have to have house rules or mods or whatever. This is why I love Conquest of Elysium, where I don't love something like Age of Wonders 4 anymore, because, Conquest of Elysium, you can just blast your enemy with these most ridiculously broken stuff, like a necromancer spamming out death spell, and your 200-man army dies in 3 turns or whatever, and you're just like, what just happened?
Yeah.
Jackie Chan, like. But then in Age of Wonders, it just feels everything's so balanced. Every battle takes ages because, you're just doing small increments, piddling amounts of damage. It's just everything always hits. There's no real RNG in it. There's no room for epic comebacks from overwhelming odds. It's just bland. Again, we're sort of straying away from RTS. I don't see that so much in modern RTS games, actually. I feel that at least the ones that I've played, I don't know, actually, because I played Dune Spice Wars and that kind of felt a bit like that, actually. But Shaun, you play modern RTS games a little bit more, man. How do you feel? Do you, talking about the power fantasy and kind of allowing players to come up with sort of broken stuff in order to I suspect that it's not there because most of the RTS games seem to be made for esports now. What do you reckon?
I don't think I've played a lot of modern classic style RTSs. I know when you refer to Dune Spice Wars, it's, I don't know, technically it's an RTS 4X hybridy thing, whatever. But a lot of the gameplay there is not really based on the RTS component. It's more the background stuff. There's a lot of politics, subterfuge, and that kind of thing. And it's not an RTS. Northgard is more of leaning towards your RTS kind of thing. And I remember even that, I think it even had a bit dodgy pathfinding and things like that. And it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. But yeah, that's more leaning towards your RTS. And then when they did put in any kind of like super basic, you couldn't really call it diplomacy. It's just trading with neutrals. But when they add mechanics to that all the time. Like it's a totally different game to when it first launched. Whereas Spice Wars kind of launched with a lot of that stuff and then some. So yeah, Spice Wars, yeah, I think it's more, yeah, your background stuff. But you can do stuff in there. Like in Spice Wars, you can build nukes. You can launch nukes at other players. And it'll help you if you want to attack a city, because the cities are incredibly strong. You can't just rush them with a bunch of units because you'll die. I actually tried that. I did a playthrough as not the newest house, the last one they released when it came out with 1.0. I was, what happens if I rush this city? Because you used to be able to do that in the earlier builds. And I got destroyed. You couldn't do it. So what I ended up trying was I launched a nuke at the city, and the city would then it'd take, I think, damage ticks, and it would make it more vulnerable to your attacks. But the downside of that was you would be a complete pariah in the Landsrat, in the council. You'd lose all political favor, everything like it. And it's sort of how it worked, kind of how it works in the real world, right? If you're going to launch a nuke at someone, everyone's going to hate you. Everyone's going to want you dead.
Yeah.
So that was really cool. You could do a lot of cool stuff with it, but the RTS component is definitely not its strength.
Yeah,
I mean, of other modern ones.
It had a really clever gameplay, and it really did give you the feel of being in, the Dune universe with all the political stuff, the espionage things that you were doing. It had some really weird game design decisions though. So they've got this supply system, because obviously you're in Dune, you're running out of water. You need to have water in order to be able to do anything. And this it was put in there, I think, to stop you from being able to kite enemy units. So you can't use any traditional RTS tactics in that game, and at least until you stockpile loads of water if you want to play like that. So it stops you if you try and approach it like an RTS game where you're trying to kite an enemy, for example. You just can't do that. Your troops will just start dying. So that's kind of weird. And they're like, oh, we don't want attention to be a resource, and yet they put a mechanic in the game where you're harvesting spice, you automatically get a carryall comes and picks the harvester up if a worm sign comes. So the sandworm's going to come. But they gave you you actually get more spice if you watch the harvester and manually pick the harvester, collect the harvester with the carryall. So they're like, oh, we don't want attention to be a resource in this game, and yet your attention is a resource. They literally put that in there. So it was just, kind of, I just thought it had some really bad design decisions, despite being a very, very intriguing and mechanics-rich game. I'd give it, yeah, it's a decent game. It's sold incredibly well. Look at that. What's that? 10,000 mostly positive reviews. So, I mean, they've got what? 200,000 sales.
Yeah, I mean, you normally multiply it by about 20.
20,
right?
yeah. So it's 400,000
plus.
200,000 sales. So that's pretty damn good. That's pretty damn good. It's doing well.
It should
It's
be
not
more
a
than
bad
that. I
game.
don't know. Because I know even their other game,
Yeah.
War Tales, it's fairly niche in itself. And I think I remember seeing something the other day. They just cracked 1 million copies on that. So if that sold 1 million copies, I wonder if this could be kind of pretty well up there, because I think it's more well known than War Tales. So
Guys, I think
this is beautiful though. I like that.
Yeah, you should
Go
try
ahead.
it actually, Lucid. It's a good game. I mean, it is a good game. I know it sounds like I'm trashing it. I'm not. Apart from the pathfinding problems I had, which I assume would be fixed by now. But it's an intriguing game. It's interesting. I think we probably should start thinking about moving towards wrapping it up. And let's try to get back to the original question, which was, is RTS dead? Is it a dead genre? Maybe we can just have a bit of a chat about that now and see what we think about that premise.
like thoughts on the future kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think of the premise? Is it true? Is RTS dead? I mean, clearly not, my opinion.
No, it's still there, but I think it's become more the domain of indie studios, and it's because it's so hard to get right, a lot of those don't do well either. But if someone, there was a video I think that Lucid shared a while ago. I actually had watched it before, but I went back and rewatched it. That Grant Giant Games video about the next RTS will fail, and he was talking about if it comes out and it's got the single player components and the technical side is solid. This is it's a tall order, right? Not everyone can do this. It's got the technical side that's solid. It's got the campaign. It's got a robust map editor. It's got, you can make user generated content that'll tide you over for years and years. And I don't know if you really even need, like, you can have a multiplayer component, but I don't know if you need a really serious multiplayer component. Maybe that's just me. I haven't really been a competitive player for ages, so I'm not caught up with that. But there's a lot of things to get right. But if someone gets it right, they'll crush it, I think. So there's that. You're just sort of waiting for someone to get it right. And I'm hoping something like was it Steel Ironworks, the ones working on Tempest Rising, can do something like that. Because I've spoken to Brandon Castile before, and he gets it. Like, you can't shut him up about this stuff once he starts talking. Like, he's just this absolute goldmine of information about this stuff. He lives and breathes. So if his team can get that right, maybe they'll be it. I don't know. But then also, well, like I said, they're also leading into these hybrid sort of games, like Spice Wars for one. I suppose it really, with Spice Wars, you want to play it more the 4X side, I think, or the strategy side than the RTS side. But there's games out there that have been done. They're trying new things. There's even ones like Line War, where it's sort of like an auto battler, but then you can control where your units go and how they engage and that kind of their tactics. And then there's another one called Annihilate the Expanse, which is similar. It's still coming up. But then you've got other games still coming out. Like, you've got your Beyond All Reasons, they're okay. They're out. There's one in the works called Sanctuary Shattered Sun, which is, I think, either like a Total Annihilation or Supreme Commander kind of spiritual successor. And there's supposed to be a demo of that coming out shortly. So there's still studios doing something like this, and it's really hard to get right. But I think if a studio can nail it, they do really, really well. So it's not dead, but it's kind of, I don't really know. I don't think it's dead anyway.
So but you brought up a very important point, right? So a couple of really important points I wouldn't mind commenting on. One is that there are games that are sort of hybrid RTS games. So obviously we've talked about Total War. We've talked about Dune Spice Wars. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Sins of a Solar Empire 2 a little bit, because that's another game that's kind of a 4X, but it's, it's kind of more an RTS game with a 4X element kind of tying it together. That's done pretty well. I won't talk about it too much because obviously I do work for Stardock. So it's kind of, I shouldn't really talk about it too much, but this has done really, really well. And it broke that idea that you've got to have a campaign, right? So Sins of Solar Empire 2 doesn't have a campaign, at least yet. So it didn't have a campaign, and yet it's done pretty well for a game, for a game of that size.
Well, it does have single player, right?
It does have single player.
It's primarily a single player game.
Primarily,
most people play it that way.
I think so. Here's what you got to understand about RTS, right? In my opinion, especially, and it's the same with other games genres. Like I said, you've got about 90% of the people who buy that game are going to play for 20, 30 hours. Then you've got probably another sort of 8% maybe of people who stick with the game, and they'll play past the campaign, and they will play skirmishes. They will get really good at the game. They'll push their difficulty to the highest level. And then you've got about 2% of players who are the people who mod the game. They play competitive multiplayer. They are the guys who form that 2,000 or so players who've been playing Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion since it was released in 2012. They're those guys who are just hardcore, right? The challenge with releasing an RTS game, I think, is converting as many of those, kind of casual gamers into the tier 2 gamer who pushes the difficulty, who plays all the skirmish maps, tries to see all the content, doesn't just shelve the game after 20 hours, leaves the happy thumbs up and then goes play something else. And Sins of a Solar Empire is doing pretty well there. It's always had a fairly solid amount of people who stick around. It's also got a mad modding scene, a very, very healthy modding scene. So you've got Star Wars mods, Star Trek, Halo. There's all these, crazy mods for the original game, which is starting to filter through into the new game. So what was the other point that Shaun made that I wanted to talk about? Oh, anyway, don't worry. Over to you, Lucid. What do you think about that?
I think in the modern era, a lot of game studios, they want to release the next $500 million game. And to do that, they want to put a $200 million budget behind it or something like that.
Yep.
And certain types of things you can scale that way. Like you can just go out and buy good graphic artists, right? And you can give them a style and they can hit it. And if you pay them enough money, you can have really good assets in your game. But I think some things that don't necessarily scale that well are good coding. So having a really robust backend behind your game with really good systems. The idea that you're going to put a ton of money into a game and it's just going to be amazing and you're going to get all your money back plus a lot for a really big game, I don't think that necessarily plays out the way a lot of these studios think it does.
Yeah, that's
I think
clear.
the best test when you're developing this is you look at Marines versus Zergs in StarCraft 2, and that is for just only 2 units. It's so satisfying. Look how they move, look how they attack, look how the Marines stutter step. Like, you need a really good, crunchy, feel-good mechanics, I think, to have a good RTS. Like, and that goes into all the technical things about pathfinding and stuff. And then I think the other thing is don't be too concerned about multiplayer balance. If you're going to have a big multiplayer scene, then yeah, update things. But especially at the beginning, it's power fantasy. Have big armies and have the big armies do cool things and don't have all the units in the armies feel the same. Having 5 types of riflemen is not really interesting. Having a rifleman who has a cannon that blows an entire line through. It's one of the things. Look at this. I have the full size one, but wait, how do I go back? But if you look at this guy. He's about to stomp. He's going to just fuck up whatever is down here. Like
Absolutely.
Whatever unit down here is going to get crushed.
It's the power fantasy. You're dead right, man. You're dead right.
Yeah. Like
you got to get
love
that right.
Like have cool stuff that does cool things.
And allow people to break it a little bit. Be happy. Like, because one thing that I think what you have to understand is that most of the complaints about balance for these games often comes from that 2% of people who stick around to play multiplayer. I remember Rob from Explorminate ran a poll. And this was for 4X, but I reckon it's going to be across most game types, right? Rob figured through a poll of about 3,000 people, so it was a reasonable size of the 4X gaming population. Only 5% of them had ever tried multiplayer in a 4X. Not just regular players, but had ever tried it. So when you are making a game and you are taking, you're kind of doing this design by committee thing from 2% of your hardcore, autistic, like sweaty, try hard multiplayer people who cry about balance constantly. And so you flatten your game down. You end up with games like Age of Wonders 4, where it's kind of boring because it's so overbalanced. And I don't mean to be too mean about it. That's a great game in many ways, by the way. But what it doesn't do for me is power fantasy. It doesn't do it for power fantasy for me. It just doesn't do anything. Whereas
it doesn't do it at all.
I want slightly broken game. I want shit like in Dominions, where you can cast a spell that basically ends the game because everybody dies of old age unless you deal with it, right?
Yeah.
I want stuff that that respects your intelligence as a player and goes, here's something crazy, you got to now deal with it, and hopefully you can deal with it. And if it's a single player game,
right,
you should be able to break the game to bust the AI up. That's your prerogative, man. So, and most of these people only play single player. So why the hell are we taking games design advice from? I mean, no offense. If you're one of these multiplayer sweaty tryhards, thumbs up, man. You keep the games going, and I appreciate that. That's really, really important. But that kind of game design, doesn't really make good games for, it doesn't make enthralling power fantasy single player content, generally speaking. Now, people will go, well, Age of Wonders 4 sold X amount of copies, and it did. It's sold incredibly well. It's also got a really, really low amount of people who still play it compared to who bought it. More than any other game I've looked at recently. It's got really low player retention. So it was certainly one of those games where loads of people bought it.
Yeah.
And then they left the thumbs up and said, oh, yeah, 20 hours. Yep, good game, like that, blah, blah, blah. And then actually, how many people are playing it now? I think it's probably still got about 10,000
it's
people.
like nobody.
It's pretty good.
I think I need to have the other one.
For 4X, man, it's big numbers for a 4X. But
a lot of sales, but it's not a lot of players.
Yeah, it's not compared. I think I can't remember what I forget what the standard fall off rate is.
Oh, wow.
About 10%.
5,000 people are playing now.
It's still pretty good, but yeah, I mean, they do regularly, because Paradox are clever and they regularly do.
Oh, they just had a new update.
They have updates
Okay,
and they have
yeah.
regular DLC. That's what keeps people coming back.
Well, that's good.
But I mean,
I thought it was a lot lower than this.
I like the tactical combat in Age of Wonders. I think it's good fun, but it's not. I want Conquest of Elysium Death Spell. You know what I mean? I want stuff to. I want to see shit die.
Yeah,
I want
I
to
think
be able to nuke someone's army, and because they didn't think to counter it. Here's just a very quick example of how Age of Wonders has got really bland, stupid, made for scrubs games design. Right, in Master of Magic, if you had a flying unit and you were lazy, or you're a new player, or you're lazy and you don't bother building anything that can attack that flying unit, you're going to lose the battle, because it's hard coded, so you can't hit the flying unit, right? And that's fun. That is fun. Okay, it may be not fun the first time you run into it, but you restart and then you know how to deal with it.
I don't know if it's fun the second time you run into it either. Maybe like the 10th time.
But you've got to, but you know that is in your enemy's capability, so it stops.
Yeah.
It's one of the natural balancing mechanics that stops you doing stuff like just spamming out one type of unit. Because if someone comes up to you with one flying invisible warship or whatever, you've got to deal with it. Actually, that's quite clever. Now, Age of Wonders goes, players don't like that. Let's just remove flying units. This is modern games design. Yeah, this is what they do.
Yeah,
they cut out exciting core features of the original games, because players leave the negative Steam review because they run into something that they can't deal with. And we're lucky in the Dominions community because it attracts high IQ people, basically, who are willing to lose a few times or 10 before they see the victory screen, and they are, they grow to appreciate the kind of broken, unbalanced stuff, right? But you don't get that chance with most video games. So this is what I mean by I say, if you want to appeal to more people, you've got to dumb your game down. And that runs contrary to, so what sells games is often runs counter to what makes good games, in my opinion. So, yeah. And I think Age of Wonders is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, you kind of stole my thunder a little bit. Just kidding.
I'm sorry, man.
Yeah, I was on my wrap up comments, but no, it's good. I agree.
I apologize. Sorry, man.
A lot of it. I don't even necessarily see it as a huge trade off between single player and multiplayer, except that multiplayer babies are crying for balance. But I think you want to have really cool stuff, and so your game should be cool and have big cool stuff, and that's part of the power fantasy of being a general of an army. And I think how you balance that is pretty interesting. And I think that's a whole separate podcast, which is, I think it has to do with stat systems. And that gets into what you were talking about with flying units, is that I think the worst way to design games is to give things a ton of hit points and then give them a plus 20% damage versus cavalry or whatever. This hard coded in rock, paper, scissors type of game design, I think, is a literal cancer. And there's a fair amount of that in Total War Warhammer. And so I think to have interesting balance where you can put really cool stuff in, but you can balance it from multiplayer. Like Dominions, I think, does this well. You can spend a ton of money and have something that's really nice, and it dies to something that's pretty shitty. So I have a lot of thoughts on that. But I think like the core thing is,
there was something real quick I just wanted to point out. So it was a little comment, I guess, on sustainability, because you're talking about really, they have these $200 million budgets and they release these big games. And I think we talked about this on an earlier episode with Ben and I, but we're talking about they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on these games. And if it flops, it's a really big flop. But I was just looking at comparison, right? So Stormgate came out, it's at Mixed. It's got, 6,500 reviews. Cross Giant Studios, ex-Blizzard employees, they have a team. I think there's half a dozen people that are like leads, but they obviously got a team because they need to be a lead of something. They're not just doing it themselves. And then compared that to Godsworn. Now, I haven't actually played Godsworn yet. I'm sort of waiting for it to get a bit further along before I buy in. But that's made by 2 people, and it's going for like a Warcraft 3 style campaign-driven co-op kind of thing. Like they're not targeting the multiplayer scene; they're targeting the campaign and co-op market. And that's got a lot less reviews, but it's much higher rated. So this sort of was an interesting comparison that you see it can be done, and it can be done with a small team. That small team just has to really know what they're doing by the look of it. Yeah, that was my
Well, I think that actually gets at one of the reasons I think that's hard to do a modern big budget real-time strategy game is because I think the crunchy, like to have really good combat, it's a lot of back end work that has to be done by programmers. It's not like you just code movement or something and you have a good movement or pathfinding algorithm, or you code some of the raw mechanics and you're done. There's a lot of systems in a game. And if you want it to feel good, like the whole way Zerglings surround stuff, you have to have Zerglings to code them to behave correctly in a way. So there's some feedback through that. And I think if you have a huge team, if you imagine you're a studio and you have like 200-person team, you want to use all your 200 people. You don't want them sitting around, the artist not doing stuff, right? So I think there's a thing that to make some of these games feel good, you have to be in what I would call a pre-production phase, where you're doing a bunch of testing and playing with things and see what feels good. And you have to have, how would this unit work? How would this work? And you have to be able to play. And I think to do that, you have to not be in production mode for a pretty long while with a pretty big group of people. And if you're a team of 40 people and you can make some game that's going to sell super well so that you guys can just screw around for like a year before you're like really entering production mode on your next game, you can do that. But if you're like, okay, we just finished this one, we need to do like new version of this next one, then it's like, okay, you have to come up with a waterfall chart for all the features you're going to put in. The game designers say what it is, and then everybody takes their marching orders and goes and does it. But if you don't have that playfulness where you're figuring out, how are we going to make this unit as cool as it possibly could be, and like make it feel really good. And the cool units shouldn't just be the big ones. It should be the small ones like the Zerglings and the Marines.
Yep. How long do you
Then
think
you
that
don't
period
really-
should be, Lucid? Because, before you start thinking about that vertical slice stuff, how long do you think people should just be brainstorming and playing? Because my instinctual feeling would be the longer you do it, the better. But I actually think that's probably not true. There must be some optimal amount of time, but it's got to be like some it's got to be like 6 months, say. I mean, or maybe.
I think at least.
At least,
I think, I don't know what it is. And I mean, the longer it is, like, somebody might make your game while you're trying to make it, like time to market matters.
Yes.
So, but so I don't know the answer, but I think there is a tendency when you have a very big team to want to use them and to go into production mode. And it makes sense. If I were paying like $30 million a year or something for a studio, I would want them working. I wouldn't want them like sitting around and brainstorming,
This is why some of the wonderful indie games that have come out are just some of the best games, because often it's a guy who's doing it, at the weekend and in the evenings after his day job, and he's not really got so much to lose. I mean, look how well Manor Lords did, and it's not even finished yet. And I know that guy was working on the game for years, but I mean, that's sold like hotcakes. So I reckon he had plenty of time to think about that game before he kind of like he started even coding it, most likely.
So I guess that's kind of my take. I mean, I have other things to say about balance bumpers in games, and we talked a lot about world building, and then, I think there's also the whole thing of like map creators and sandbox things. But I think the main thing is that, like, this would be my 1 or 2 sentence summary, is that RTS games have like a really technical back end, and to make like the combat feel really, really good, it's actually like not trivial. It's actually really hard, and a lot of games fail at it. And you need to be in like a long pre-production mode where you like make these things feel really good and look really good. And that's like where you get some of your art design figured out, and you get like a bunch of these things figured out. And I think like if studios did that more, we'd have probably better RTS games. But I think there's a huge market for it. I don't think it's hard to sell. Like if you did all these things and you do it well, you could sell 6 million copies pretty easily. I think some of that's up for debate if you need to be tied on to like an IP or a franchise, but
the IP or franchise is free immersion. It's free immersion. If you got Star Wars, or you've got Star Trek, or you've got Battlestar Galactica or whatever, you have already done 90% of the work needed to get people to give a shit. Okay, because and it onboards people as well, because everybody knows. Let's say we would just forget about anything that came after Return of the Jedi, right? But if you see Luke Skywalker, you know what he does. You know what a TIE fighter is, right? You know what stormtroopers do. You got to shoot them, yeah. So you've already done most of the work. because games are so expensive to make now, games developers have become incredibly risk averse in in making their own things. So having a franchise already available, pre-packaged, is one of the reasons why you keep seeing these fucking remakes, these soulless cash grab remakes, is because it's cheap. It's cheap. That's the reason. It's cheap, and that you go, hey, remember Star Wars? And everyone goes, oh yeah, you go to the Memberberry School of Games Design. So it's cheap. But you've got that. One of the big issues with, so just to segue into one of the points that I want to make for my final thing is, for my final kind of like thought on this, we should be going back and looking at the older games and figuring out what it was exactly that really drew those millions of sales in the late 90s. Like, I was amazed looking at that first cinematic from Red Alert again today, and looking at just how damn tight it was in immersing you in that game world in just 2 minutes, or however long that short cinematic runs. And then that short cinematic before the first mission. Like, every line was sculpted to perfection to tell a story, to, in just a few words, or even just a glance between people. It's just perfect. I think we need to go back and look at those and figure out what is it that they were doing.
I don't think it's a huge industry. I mean, I think it's just cool shit. Like you're talking about going back in time and grabbing Hitler. Like, they didn't have like a high paid writer to like write the script for this. This isn't Shakespeare.
No,
it's like a cheesy B movie where they go back in time and grab Hitler.
But the execution
sounds cool.
But the execution is like, so good though, Lucid. That's why it's so powerful.
You and I were talking about like the world building in Total War, not Total War, in Warhammer Dawn of War 1. It's like when you watch a killer, what are they called again? Killer Khans?
Killer Khans, the orc.
Killer Khans.
Yeah,
when he picks up a little like space marine and like fucking holds him in his hand and is like sawing him in half and blood's going everywhere. Like,
yeah, man.
That's world building.
That's what I
like. You just do cool shit. Don't not do cool shit. Nobody wants to sit there and watch people talk about random stuff that they don't actually care about for 5 minutes to start it off.
Yeah, but if you want to make money and be successful, you've got to get the casual gamers to give a shit first. So you've got Warhammer it's an instant sell. Now, by the way, when Dawn of War was released,
here's my free opening.
Sorry, go ahead.
Here's my free opening for like a start of a game. Right, you have like an army, you go out, you do the tutorial mission, and like, so you learn how to move stuff, and then it's like, okay, go to this next area, and in the next area, like some of the cool shit in the game, it's owned by the other player, and it just comes out and massacres you. And then it's like, okay, now like you run away, and then you go on to the next mission.
Yeah, right.
Like,
okay.
I mean, it's
show the power.
Like, you just have to show, yeah, or you could do a cut scene where some of this happens. It's like, okay, I think you just have to have cool shit in the game.
You do.
So if we were going to wrap this up, sorry, I'm just keep checking out. My kids are making a racket. If we can sort of wrap it up in one easy bundle. So none of us really believe that it's not really a dead genre, right? There is a future, but it needs a solid technical back end, and it needs cool shit, and it needs a lot of cool shit.
Yeah.
Is that basically the conclusion?
And it's got to know who you've got to know who you're marketing at. Don't be taking all your game design decisions from 2% of the potential player base.
But I mean, even the 2%, they like cool shit. Like, I think like if you want to make a game, like think about what cool shit you want to have in the game, and then like that should be in it. Like, use with animals, and then you have like the fucking animals eating each other and like tearing each other apart. I don't know. Like, that's probably not a fun game, but like if it has enough cool shit in it, like an elephant walking through and it like gores like a lion and the lion's like stuck on its tusk. People would talk about that.
Sure.
But it's got, and it doesn't have to be dark. It could also be light. You could have like, I don't know, some kind of kids version, but they like do cool things.
I don't feel that rule of cool is enough. I need tight game design as well, at least for me. If it's I'm not talking about what's going to sell a game. And I think that's, you're making a really good point there. Like, if you've got cool stuff in the game and people can see that, but you've got to get eyes on that game first. Yeah. And it's not that easy to
No,
do unless you've got an existing franchise. At least, you know, in
it
terms.
needs to play and feel well. But if you want 5 flavors of swordsmen that do different damage and 5 flavors of archers that do like different damage, or riflemen, like I'm not going to play the game. I want to see cool shit in there.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with you completely. I'm over the number wang school of game design, if you know what that is, where it's just everything's just about pushing a different color of number. Oh, this one's fire damage. This one's acid damage. This one's electric damage. Okay, cool. I want to see something kill the whole army in one fucking go. That's what I want to see.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so I think we've thoroughly covered that topic anyway. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. There's some interesting videos on this topic if you want to go and check it out for yourself. And, you know, maybe you can let us know in the comments whether you think that RTS is a dead genre, whether you think it's a really great genre, but, you know, we just need more of the games. Thank you very much to Lucid Tactics and Shaun for coming along and joining me on this. I really, really appreciate it, guys.
Of course, mate. It was tons of fun. See you next time.
So good, man. I'll be here next week.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, make sure you like and subscribe. If you're enjoying the podcast, by the way, please share it with your friends. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time. Take it easy.